Pagan deities demonized. Imagine a world teeming with gods. A world where every forest, every river, every hearth, and every storm had a spirit, a deity, a guardian. This was the spiritual landscape of pre-Christian Europe and the Near East. A vibrant, complex tapestry of belief systems woven over thousands of years. From the horned gods of the Celtic groves to the household protectors of Rome, these were not abstract concepts. They were living, breathing forces in the daily lives of millions. But as a new faith, Christianity, began its inexorable rise, it faced a monumental challenge. It couldn't just coexist with this sprawling pantheon. To establish its singular truth, it had to dismantle, discredit, and ultimately conquer the old gods. And it did so not just by tearing down temples of stone, but by waging a clandestine war on heaven itself. A war of redefinition, a campaign of theological rebranding that would forever alter the Western conception of good and evil. This wasn't a simple case of replacement, of saying, our God is real and yours are not. The strategy employed by the early church was far more sophisticated and psychologically potent. It was a process we now call interpretatio Christiana, or Christian interpretation. In its most benign form, this meant absorbing pagan holidays and sacred sites, like placing Christmas near the winter solstice or building churches on top of ancient groves. But when it came to the gods themselves, this interpretation took a much darker turn. Instead of declaring them non-existent, the Church Fathers made a chillingly brilliant move. They declared them real, but real in a terrifying new way. They were not gods, they were demons. This strategic demonization served multiple, crucial purposes for the nascent church. First and foremost, it provided undeniable proof of the Christian worldview. By acknowledging the power of pagan entities but reframing them as malevolent, the church validated the spiritual experiences of new converts. Their old gods did have power, the missionaries could argue, but it was a deceptive, corrupting power sourced from the abyss, from Lucifer, the great enemy of the one true God. This made conversion less of a denial of one's past experiences and more of a spiritual awakening to their true, sinister nature. A person's lifelong reverence for a nature spirit wasn't foolish. It was a testament to the cunning of the devil, who had masqueraded as a benevolent force to lead humanity astray. This approach was far more effective than outright dismissal. Secondly, it established a clear, unassailable moral and spiritual dichotomy. Paganism was often morally ambiguous, with gods who exhibited very human-like flaws: jealousy, lust, and wrath. Christianity, in its quest for universal appeal and order, required a starker contrast. There was God, the embodiment of pure good, and there was Satan, the source of all evil. By casting the entire pagan pantheon into the demonic camp, the church created a vast army for its cosmic enemy. Every non-Christian ritual, every idol, every folk tradition became an act of consorting with the enemy, a direct affront to God. This simplified the spiritual world into a battlefield with two clear sides, making the choice for potential converts a stark one: salvation or damnation. The theological justification for this was meticulously constructed by influential thinkers like Augustine of Hippo. In his seminal work, The City of God, Augustine argued that the gods of the pagans were, in fact, fallen angels, demons who, in their pride and rebellion, sought the worship that was due only to God. They could perform feats that seemed miraculous, grant boons, and answer prayers, but it was all a trap, a lure to draw souls away from the path of righteousness. This provided the intellectual framework, the scriptural and philosophical backbone for a systematic campaign of spiritual warfare. Priests and missionaries were now armed with a powerful narrative. The old ways weren't just wrong, they were a demonic conspiracy. Every sacred spring was a potential gateway to hell, every ancestral statue an idol housing a malevolent spirit. This war was waged on all fronts. Sermons thundered from pulpits, warning congregations against the demons their grandparents had worshipped. The lives of saints, or hagiographies, became popular tales of heroic Christians battling these ancient deities, now cast as monstrous dragons, seductive temptresses, or cunning devils. Saint Patrick, for example, wasn't just said to have driven snakes from Ireland, a land with no native snakes, but this story is widely seen as a metaphor for his driving out the old pagan, serpentine faiths. The gods weren't ignored, they were actively hunted, their stories rewritten, their characters assassinated. This was a hostile takeover of the spiritual realm, a process that laid the essential groundwork for transforming revered figures of light and life into the very archetypes of darkness and terror that would haunt the Christian imagination for millennia to come. The stage was set for a grand transformation, where gods would be dethroned and remade into the monsters of a new age. Specific transformations. With the theological blueprint for demonization in place, the Church began its meticulous work of re-engineering the spiritual world, one deity at a time. This wasn't a vague, abstract process. It was a targeted campaign of character assassination, focusing on the most powerful and beloved figures of the old ways. The goal was to take the very attributes that made a god revered and twist them into symbols of fear and corruption. Perhaps no figure illustrates this more perfectly than the Celtic deity known as Cernunnos, the horned god. Worshipped across Gaul and Britain, Cernunnos was a lord of the wild, a god of animals, fertility, and the untamed natural world. His most prominent feature was a majestic set of stag's antlers, a symbol of virility, seasonal cycles, and the raw power of nature. To the Celts, he was a figure of immense respect, representing the life force that pulsed through the ancient forests. To the Christian missionaries, however, these attributes were a goldmine of demonic potential. The horns, a symbol of masculine power and connection to the animal kingdom, were grotesquely reinterpreted. They were no longer the crown of a nature god, but the mark of the beast, the ultimate symbol of satanic evil. His association with the wild, once seen as sacred, was reframed as a connection to chaos, savagery, and the lawless spaces outside of God's grace. The forest, Cernunnos' domain, became a place of temptation and danger where demons lurked. Even his companions, the animals, were seen as his familiars, lesser demons in his service. The torque he wore, a symbol of nobility and divinity, could be seen as a chain of enslavement. The serpent he often held, a symbol of rebirth and earthly energy, was already conveniently identified with the tempter from the Garden of Eden. Through this systematic inversion of meaning, a benevolent god of life was meticulously transformed into the archetypal, horned Christian devil that we recognize today. This pattern was repeated across cultures. In the Greek world, there was Pan, another horned god of the wild, shepherds, and rustic music. Pan was also associated with unbridled lust and panic. The very word panic comes from his name. This made him an incredibly easy target. His half-goat, half-man form, his unrestrained sexuality, and his wild, chaotic nature were cherry-picked and amplified. His physical form, the cloven hooves and hairy legs, merged with the horns of Cernunnos and other similar figures to create the definitive visual template for Satan. The god who once represented the raw, untamed spirit of nature was reduced to a caricature of pure, hedonistic evil, a tempter who lured good Christians into sin. The campaign didn't stop with the major gods. It extended down to the smallest, most intimate spirits of daily life. The Romans, for example, revered the quarry, guardian spirits of the household and hearth. These were benevolent entities who protected the family and ensured prosperity. Under the new Christian framework, these helpful spirits couldn't be allowed to exist. So they were demoted and demonized, transformed into mischievous imps, disruptive poltergeists, or house goblins. A spirit that once brought comfort and protection was now a source of anxiety, a tiny demon that might sour the milk, hide your tools, or cause things to go bump in the night, a constant nagging reminder of the ever-present forces of evil. Even the ethereal and powerful beings of Celtic lore, the Cid or fair folk, were not spared. In their original context, the Cid were not tiny winged pixies. They were a proud, potent, supernatural race living in a parallel world, whose interactions with humans could be benevolent, dangerous, or simply inscrutable. They were forces to be respected and appeased. Christianity couldn't tolerate such a powerful, morally ambiguous third party. So the Cid were split. Some were sanitized and diminished into the tiny, harmless fairies of children's stories. But many others were cast as malevolent demons. They became the goblins, the trolls, and the child-stealing monsters of folklore. Their magical mounds became entrances to hell, and their otherworldly beauty became a demonic glamour used to ensnare mortal souls. This process was brutally effective. It weaponized folklore, turning beloved local traditions against the very people who practiced them. The gods and spirits who had once offered protection, explained the turning of the seasons, and given meaning to the landscape, were now presented as the direct agents of damnation. This wasn't just a change in theology, it was a profound psychological operation that injected fear and suspicion into the very heart of pre-Christian culture, ensuring that even in the most remote village, the old gods would not be remembered as they were, but as the fallen, monstrous foes of a triumphant new faith. Block 3. Legacy and Impact. The demonization of pagan deities was not a mere footnote in religious history. It was a foundational act that profoundly shaped the spiritual, psychological, and cultural landscape of Western civilization for the next 2 millennia. The long-term consequences of this secret war on heaven are so deeply embedded in our culture that we often fail to recognize their origins. Its most immediate and obvious legacy was the creation of a rich and terrifying Christian demonology. Early Christianity had a relatively simple concept of evil centered on Satan and a vague notion of fallen angels. But by absorbing and inverting the pagan pantheons, the Church suddenly had a vast, detailed hierarchy of hell. Gods of agriculture and wealth, like the Canaanite Baal or the Greco-Roman Plutus, were reborn as powerful dukes of hell, such as Beelzebub, the Lord of the Flies, or Mammon, the very personification of greed. Goddesses of love and sexuality, like Astarte or Venus, were transformed into succubi, demonic seductresses who preyed on pious men. Each demon in the grimoires of the Middle Ages and Renaissance, from the lowliest imp to the most powerful archdevil, carried the faint, twisted echo of a god or spirit that was once worshipped. This complex demonology provided the raw material for centuries of art, literature, and theology, from the grotesque demons tormenting saints in medieval paintings to the epic demonic battles in John Milton's. The Church didn't just defeat the old gods, it conscripted their ghosts into its own cosmic narrative of damnation. The psychological impact on the newly converted populations was immense. The natural world, once seen as a sacred place filled with divine spirits, was rendered spiritually hostile. The forest was no longer the domain of a life-giving Cernunno, but the haunt of the devil. A sudden storm was not the wrath of a thunder god who could be appeased, but a manifestation of demonic power. This instilled a deep-seated fear of the non-human world and severed the intimate, spiritual connection many people had with their natural environment. It also dramatically elevated the Church's position. In a world now swarming with these newly defined demons, the Church was no longer just a path to salvation in the next life. It was the defense against the terrifying supernatural forces assailing humanity in this one. The priest, the holy water, the crucifix, these became the essential weapons in an ongoing war, cementing the Church's role as the indispensable spiritual protector. This legacy of fear culminated in one of the darkest chapters of European history, the witch trials. The image of the witch, as it crystallized in the late Middle Ages, is a direct product of this ancient demonization. Accused witches were often charged with worshipping the devil in the form of a horned, goat-like man, a clear echo of Cernunno and Pan. They were said to attend Sabbaths in wild, remote places, cavorting with nature spirits that had long been rebranded as demonic familiars. The entire mythology of witchcraft was built upon the inverted remnants of pre-Christian folk beliefs and deities. The war against the old gods became a brutal, violent war against those, mostly women, who were accused of keeping their memory alive. Even today, these ancient transformations resonate. Our modern archetypes of evil are still heavily influenced by these demonized figures. The popular image of the devil, with his horns, hooves, and association with wild carnal desires, is not a biblical description. It is a composite sketch, a Frankenstein's monster assembled from the dismembered parts of pagan nature gods. The very idea of goblins, trolls, and malevolent sprites that populate our fantasy genres are the direct descendants of nature and household spirits that were cast into the shadows. This ancient campaign of redefinition was so successful that it has become our cultural default. It demonstrates the immense power of narrative to shape reality. By rewriting the stories of its rivals, the Church didn't just win a religious conflict. It fundamentally redefined the concepts of the sacred and the profane, a redefinition that continues to echo in the very soul of the West. The gods may have been defeated, but their transformed shadows still linger.